Jonas Africa.
You stood up for children's rights. Save the
Jonas.
children.
Ayangena amajoni, Jonas Africa. Ayangena amajoni, Jonas Africa. There was a lot of optimism in the 90s internally. Nelson Mandela, 1990, had been released. First of all, the ANC was unbanned and the other liberation movements. And Nelson Mandela had been had been released. And so there was a lot of optimism coming into the 90s in South Africa. The struggle heroes are coming back to the country and freedom has arrived. And we've got our country back. And so on the one side, in South Africa, domestically, we're going to look at what was going on there. Because there was also anxiety on the other side, you know. It wasn't all hunky-dory. So we'll look at that. And then also we'll look at geopolitically, the falling of the Berlin Wall. What impact did that have on South Africa? And we'll look at business. And what role did business play in South Africa in those early 90s? And then we'll touch on a little bit towards the end, sort of towards 98, 97, 98 on the economic policy. But that will be on another episode. So those are the two things really I'm going to want to look at is domestically what's going on in the early 90s and internationally, geopolitically what's going on. As I said, there's euphoria, you know. Our heroes are back, Nelson Mandela's released, and black people are black people are optimistic, you know. And I'm sure there's also white people optimistic, but also there's a lot of white anxiety. 1 minute we're fighting the terrorists and the swart gevaar and the rooi gevaar, but the swart gevaar also. And then the next minute we have to embrace them. Are they gonna, you know, are they savages? They're coming from the bush. You know, are they going to murder us? Are they going to take us are they going to drive us to the ocean? Are they going to take everything? And you could see the anxiety because capital flight it started in 1985. I mean, from 1985, you know, there was a lot of capital flight, companies divesting, Standard Bank left, Barclays left, a number of international companies left. Mobil, the oil companies, and so from business, you could clearly see that there was anxiety. And then from the population itself, I mean, people left, they went to Australia, they emigrated to the UK, to Canada. And that gives you an idea of that anxiety. I'm talking about the mood, you know. And then remember also the homelands, Botswana, Transkei, Ciskei. I don't want to call KZN a homeland. But I mean, these places were still a hotbed of internal fighting. I mean, in KZN, in Inkatha Freedom Party, IFP was at war with the ANC. And the IFP, later it came to be known that they were being funded by the apartheid government to escalate that war during that time and to escalate tensions so that within the National Party, there were people that are not happy with F.W. de Klerk releasing Nelson Mandela and unbanning the ANC. No, it wasn't all kumbaya, let's release Nelson Mandela, hold hands, you know, Rainbow Nation. No. It was war. It was war within the NP, the Broeder Bond and the National Party. And so there's those anxieties just at a humanistic level, you know, within the people themselves. Nelson Mandela, then they have the CODESA talks. Now, those CODESA talks were about economy, politics, policies, what the country, the direction, and they were steering towards a constitution. And those CODESA talks obviously were important because that was for the first time a democratic system where people were going to sit down and talk and discuss these things that they discussed, which we don't know as public. And then what came out of that was the sunset clauses, which no one knows. Oh, well, we don't know what they were. But business was heavily involved in those talks, between the ANC and the National Party. The ANC was representing the black majority. The National Party was representing the Afrikaner minority. The white business was representing white business and the rest of white minority. Because also you must remember, folks, South Africa is divided within the white race. It's divided between Afrikaners and English. One must always keep that in mind whenever one also, I think whenever one looks at or tries to look at politics and dynamics within the South African white race group, But anyway, I digress. And so these three parties were talking for their different constituencies. And so what came out of that CODESA were those agreements and contractual agreements that in a following up episode, I will deal with what I think, my perspective of what I think came out of, or rather, I don't know what came out of the contracts of CODESA, but I think somewhere along the line, those agreements, someone didn't adhere to those agreements. And I think that's why we find ourselves, or one of the reasons why we find ourselves where we are now, is because someone didn't keep their part of the agreement. So when it comes to the economy, there was a lot of heated debate. Obviously business did not want to go the socialist route. Falling of the Berlin Wall, if you remember I mentioned in my last episode, the falling of the Berlin Wall also signified one hegemony and also signified the winning of capital and neoliberalism as a political economic system. The people that had the money, because also remember, South Africa had just come out of sanctions and they had no money, and banks had taken the money out. So the state was broke. So the ANC was actually inheriting a broke state. So they had no money. And remember, the Soviet Union is broke. So who do you run to? Not the Ghostbusters, but who do you run to? Who's got the money? JP Morgan, IMF, World Bank. Remember, there's no China. There's no BRICS. These are the guys that have the money. And coming into those CODESA talks, the talk was around RDP and all these things. And I'm sure in those talks, it was like, okay, but who's going to fund the socialist programs you want to do? Because Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher are the chief cheerleaders of neoliberalism. And the Bretton Woods institutions, which is IMF and the World Bank, and we'll get to those also. They're based in the US. And they go get money from the capital markets. Who are the capital markets? JP Morgan is the capital markets. That's where they get the money from to fund countries. So socialism is not going to fly. We're not going to pay for it. Out of CODESA, 94 happens. We have the elections. No one knows what's going to happen. Remember, the falling of the Soviet Union, as I said, led in neoliberalism. So all around the world, this was the Kool-Aid that all the countries were being fed. All the countries were being fed and being given money by the IMF. And IMF and World Bank, they come with restrictions: structural adjustment, opening up, glasnost, perestroika. So all these countries are getting loans from IMF and whatnot. So this is the Kool-Aid that everyone is drinking. 96 for me, the GNU was formed. Now that GNU was very critical because that is where the current political economic system we're in now was solidified. It was formulated in Codesa. It was signed and sealed during that GNU process. Because that is where the few blacks were co-opted, or rather the few co-opted blacks, they signed the signature, BEE, and then 97, 98, we drop RDP, Redistribution Development Program. We adopt GEAR, straight out of Brenton Woods, 101. We adopt GEAR. Excuse the pun, but the economy gets kicked into gear. That was what happened. And that was what happened during our early 90s into late 90s. But that's just a very high level overview I'm giving you. There's a lot of nuance in that because business had a big role. I, for one, don't believe that the ANC went into those negotiations, especially during the GNU, not having an economic policy and believing that GEAR was the economic policy. But I think that their hands were tied. They came to the gunfight with knives and what was that gunfight? That gunfight for me was the Codesa or rather, what was that gunfight? The gunfight was the economic conversation. Because to fund socialist programs, you're going to need money. And you don't have money. And so your ammunition, which is your bullets, which is your guns that you need when you get to the fight, the conversation, you don't have ammunition. You don't have guns. Anglo-American, they've got a lot of guns. They've got a lot of guns. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts because that's how I look at. Because there's also an interesting conversation going around right now as to did the ANC sell out, and I'm also playing that conversation in my mind as I play these type of conversations through. Is in the back of my mind, did the ANC sell out? But I believe I don't know. I believe that. And I'll back this up as to why I believe that coming into the discussions around GEAR, it wasn't just, hey, we'll take GEAR, hands back. I think there was a lot of robust conversation between business and ANC to sort of try to find a middle ground. And that middle ground, in my opinion, was not going to be evident directly. That's how I think that the ANC didn't just come there blindfolded. Folks, lovely conversation. Would love to hear your thoughts, but we've got to start these conversations, these honest conversations. Because we can't rewrite history. And it's important to speak up. See you again in the next episode where I'm gonna deep dive into this period. I want to look at the different, because I believe that this period was a very important period in South Africa's history. Because the problems we find ourselves in were created during that period. The problems and the issues that we find ourselves in now were created in that period. And I think for us to, for me personally, to learn and move forward, I've got to understand what happened there. So let me try and break those new and try and break those nuances down during the 10 years of 1990 to about 2000. Join me. Like, subscribe. Please share this to someone that you think might enjoy this episode, and join me again. Uncurated Conversations with Mlamli Mayosi.